Ruchim Abayim, good morning, Morai Rabotai. We are continuing on our Smicha program, the in-depth Hilchot Shabbat, and we are in amidst Siman Shin Chaf Aleph, which is an array of different topics. We finished the first 6 Seifim, discussing various different halachot, and today we are going to focus, Be'ezrat Hashem, Seif Zayin through Seif Tet, which we're starting basically a new topic of Tochein, of grinding, crushing, cutting small pieces, and so on, as we will discuss. Now, the Gemara already discusses this in the Melechet HaMishkan, the 39 Melachot of the Mishkan. We had grinding because they had the dye that needed to be used for the Mishkan had to be first ground up and then cooked. So therefore, it was one of the 39 melachot of the Mishkan. Now the question is, the toladot of this, the outcomes of it, what is it going to exactly be? Making sawdust, cutting wood to small pieces, cutting salad to small pieces, grinding different additives, peppers, salt, and so on and so forth. All these things fall under the question of being the toladot of this this melacha. Now, the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat of Kuf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph brings in machloket in the Gemara between Rabbi Yehuda and Rava. What exactly is the parameter of this isur? Now, is it mutar to grind a single peppercorn, or is it not? So Rav Yehuda holds in the Gemara there that besides the regular shinu, you can't do it. You can't take peppercorn, crush it. The Mishnah Berurah is going to say that it's going to be a isur deoraita, even one peppercorn to crush and to grind. Now, just a moment to speak about that. We generally speaking would say the reason for that is because Chatzi Shiur Asur Min HaTorah, Machloket Resh Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, whether Chatzi Shiur is Asur from the Torah or is it Midrabanan, the end of Masechet Yuma. We're passing like Rabbi Yochanan that Chatzi Shiur is Asur Min HaTorah. On Yom Kippur, you can't eat a kotevet kasai, a large date. That's the chiyuv karet. How about if you eat half of that? Well, are you transgressing the Rabbanan or the Torah? It's the Oraita. Hatzi shiur asur min haTorah. Now here would also be the shiur of it would be kagerogeret. It would be like a dried fig. That would be the shiur of grinding, perhaps on Shabbat. So you will say, well, Chatzi Shur Asur Min HaTorah. So if you do even one single pepper, will be Asur, right? A peppercorn would be Asur. The problem is the Rambam paskins, and we hold like the Rambam, that Chatzi Shur is not necessarily Asur when you're speaking about things that are not by Isurei Achila. Yom Kippur, it's Isur Achila, right? And Shiur of it is clear. But over here, we're not talking about Isur Achila. We're talking about grinding. So Chatzi Shiur B'Melechet Shabbat is Isur D'Rabbanan, holds the Rambam, and that's what we paskin. But over here, perhaps, is not so pashut. Maybe here, according to everyone, would be Asur because it's not Chatzi Shiur. Because what is the shiur of tvalin, of different spices? By tvalin, by spices, the shiur would be in order enough to spice a kagerogeret of bitzah. You have a little scrambled egg, a small little bit, half an egg, a third of an egg, kagerogeret of an egg. And to spice that is the shiur of grinding the pepper. So maybe one peppercorn would be enough for that. Very well possible. So But the Mishnah Berurah says that this is a Isur Doraita. It may indeed be, according to everyone, that this would actually be an Isur Doraita. But generally speaking, to have one small piece when you don't have enough shi'ur would not be an Isur Doraita, because it's not a chatzi shi'ur, a normal chatzi shi'ur. It's not that you ate half of kazayit of chelev, in which case you will be liable for a doraita transgression, even though that you don't get karet. But here is melechat Shabbat. You did half a melacha on Shabbat. You didn't eat anything. And that, Rambam holds, is the Rabbanan. So hence here would be a little bit different in our discussion. So it says, that's again Machloket, Rav Yehuda and Rava. On one hand, Rav Yehuda holds that the shinui that's required needs to be two different modifications. First, even though that it's a small piece, it's only one, you're not doing a lot of pepper, but you also have to do it in a way that is shinui. So therefore, you do it individually, and you do it not with a regular meducha, with a regular grinder. Rava argues that you don't need two modifications. You don't need two different shinuim. One would be enough. Now, what's the halacha? Halacha is like Rava. We pass like Rava that really you don't have to have one only. You could have 2, 3, 4, 5 peppercorns, as long as you have shinui in the way you do it. Now, how much shinui do you need? Remember, now if you're doing more than one, for sure you're talking about a doraita transgression, right? Now you're talking about isur doraita. So what exactly is then the limit of change that you have to make? What is exactly the limit of change that you have to make for it to become mutar? Now, Rashi says that you do the handle of a knife. Rashi says you do with the handle of a knife, and that would be sufficient change in order to accomplish that you're no longer in transgression. Now, you'll say, wait a second, that's only one change. How does that make it mutar? So there are those who say the changing from a maducha, a professional stone grinder, versus the handle of a knife, that's a massive switch. That's a massive change. Because a regular shinui would be, so okay, don't do it with maducha, but take another stone and crush it well, or take a wooden maducha. That would be a small change. But to do it with the back of a knife, that's such a drastic shinui that even one shinui would be sufficient. So that's one opinion. Now, the others mention that this is not actually one shinui, it's actually two shinuis, because first of all, you're doing it with the handle of a knife, you're not doing it with a maducha. And secondly, you're not doing it in a kli that was made especially for this. You're not doing it in a mortar, which is like the maducha that's made for this. In other words, if you would do it in the mortar and you would crush it with the back of a knife, still will be one change. But if you do it on the table or in a bowl, so then you're having two different changes, and two shinuim, according to everyone, will be good. So that's kind of like the way it comes out. Now, Maran Bet Yosef brings from Shibolei Aleket, of the Rishonim, he asks the question. He says, if the grinding of the regular way, it's Isur Doraita, right? So, doing it Beshinui, at least it should be the Rabbanan. And he answers what we said first, that this is a massive switch. It's the change from a professional mortar with a grinder, that is Doraita. But when you switch to like a knife, a spoon, that's so different that it will be not only not Isur Doraita, but it's even Isur Doraita. The Rabbanan. So that's how he answers it. Now, what does the Shulchan Aruch write? Maran writes in Shulchan Aruch, and I read, Mutar laduch pilpelin afilu arbe. So right away, you see here, Maran is passing like Rava, that it's not just mutar to do one peppercorn. You could do however many you want, provided vehu sheduchem bekata shel sakin ubekara. So Maran makes a point of saying that in order to crush something or grind something, you need two modifications, two shinuim, two changes. You're not doing it in a mortar, you're not doing it in a professional kli, you're doing it in a bowl, and also you're doing it with the back of a spoon, with the back of a knife, then it would be mutar. By the way, how about grinding it with the blade of a knife, not with the back of a knife? So the Mishnah Berurah says, and this is something that we're going to take a rain check until we discuss it in Seif Yud, and mainly in Seif Yud Bet, which would be the next shiur, Be'ezrat Hashem. All of the halachot of chopping off things, small pieces of salad, the Israeli salad, and so on. Can you make those on Shabbat? Which perhaps would be a very big question, halachically speaking. That we'll leave for that. But the Mishnah already here will tell us that you cannot use a blade of a knife to small piece the peppercorn as far as the Hilchot Tochein is concerned. So he just kind of drops a bombshell that it's asur. You can't do with a blade of knife small pieces, and then we will discuss this like literally in its entirety in Seif Yud Bet. So kind of we're going to take a rain check on that, but we will mention it because we're starting to discuss this over here. So that's what Maran says. You have a peppercorn. How do you do it? Do you have to only do one at a time? No, you could do a bunch. Can you do it normally? Absolutely not. How many changes? 2. How do you do it? You do it in a bowl on a table, not in an actual mortar, and also you don't use what they used to call havang, right? You don't use the professional kli. And again, staying out of mentioning names, but any professional kli that's made for grinding or crushing, you don't use. You do it with the back of a knife, with the handle of a knife. Fine. So that's what the Shulchan Aruch says so far. Now, what is exactly the Sudoraita? So we mentioned the Mishnah Berurah over here, and I'm going to read to you the Sif Katan Chav Gimel for those who have a Mishnah Berurah. If you actually have anything that grows out of the ground, as we will see, this limitation is things that actually grow plantation of the ground, that would be asur deoraita, says the Mishnah Berurah. Va'afilu gargir echad, even one. So that we already discussed, the Rambam Shita, for Chatzi Shiur, and so on. Now, Birkei Yosef, Maran Chida, says a massive chumrah. Maran Chida was awesome, right? And usually he's not known as being a stringent posek, but over here, Maran Chida says our minhag is not to even do this whole back of the knife thing. Why not? Because if you have it in a bowl, again, you can't do it in a mortar. So if you're using a bowl, you may come to, you're crushing, so you may hit it hard and crack and break the bowl. And that would be breaking a kli on Shabbat, is now mutar, right? Ben Ish Chai also brings this concern, but Ben Ish Chai says, just be careful not to break the bowl. Yeah, you don't have to say, oh, we're not going to do it because... And the Kaf HaChaim says, break the bowl, so what? So if you're not trying to break the bowl, it's not for sure going to break. And even if it broke, it's not davar shemitkaven, so it's mutar. So leave it alone. What's the halacha lema'aseh? Mutar. Even though the Maran Chida says that their minhag was not to do this thing, nowadays if you want to do it, will be mutar. Now again, we're talking about peppers and peppercorns. Really, in a regular household, this happens to be an extremely relevant question, because if you have got a kid or even elderly adult, that you need to, puree things for them sometimes. Like, when it's hard for them, or someone that's sick, they can't swallow easily. You want to puree things. You could puree banana for them, right? Can you do it? Can you do the way you usually would puree banana? Absolutely not, right? How about meat? Like, sometimes you have little kids and you want to cut it to tiny, tiny, tiny pieces to feed meat to your kids or to adults. Again, elderly adults, parents, grandparents, and or sick people. All of that will be questions here, and all of it we'll discuss before half an hour from now, right? So these are questions that you have to actually, so 2 shinuim, for instance, Chaubadia says, make 2 shinuim with the banana and you're good to go, right? If you usually would do it with a fork, for instance, right? Not do it with the handle of a spoon and you're good to go, right? But you have to be mindful of that because it's literally in the Shulchan Aruch. You could be dealing with a potential doraita, as we just mentioned moments ago. So it says, the Kaf HaChaim, you could do it, there's no problems with that whatsoever. Now, how about doing it once you add it, like you feed your kid every 3 hours, you want to do a whole banana and get it over with. Or you're doing grinding like the peppercorn. So, it's enough for me to have to go through this craziness once on Shabbat. So I'm just going to do for the night Suda, the morning Suda, Shlishit, Chazak Baruch. Can you do that? Or can you not do that? Right? So the Mishnah Berurah says that there is no limit really in the quantity of the peppercorns that you could do. So therefore, you could do for the entire Shabbat, but you can't do more, right? You do the required amount for the Shabbat. Now, Kaf HaChaim writes over here that you can't do it for us, the Sephardim. He says you can't do it for outside of the Seudah. Every Seudah you do for itself. But here's the problem with the Kaf HaChaim. And the Pri Megadim really, and Shulchan Aruch, points out this problem. I'll read to you the language of the Shulchan Aruch again. Pri Megadim reads the Shulchan Aruch, says Maran does not hold like this Kaf HaChaim thing. Right? He was way before the Kaf HaChaim, but this concept, Maran does not differentiate between one Seudah, not one Seudah. Maran just writes, Mutar la duch pilpelin, afilu harbe. You're doing a lot of pilpelin. As long as you do it the right way, you have 2 modifications to the way it's done, mutar. Right? So therefore, don't give me the business of, okay, you're doing this Seudah 5 minutes before, do enough, just enough. You could do more, so long as it's for Shabbat. Don't do for Sunday. But if you need it for Shabbat, for the Seudah Shlishit, and you're standing on Shabbat morning, you could do it. And that's what Minchad Ahava, Moshe Levi Alav Shalom says. It's a Chaubadia, Chazon Obadia Paskins, and that's the halacha. Even though that Kaf HaChaim is a little bit more mahmir over here. Halacha l'maaseh, if you want to be mahmir, tava alav beracha, right? As my Chavruta's father used to say, "Hamachmir yesh la al ma lismoch," right? I mean, mahmir, you have what to rely on. But halacha l'maaseh would be, so Michal Perez Shlita in Mexico City. If you want mikar adin, mutar. There's no problem with that whatsoever. Now, that is the basis of the Shulchan Aruch. Now, why not in its own kli? Why not in a mortar? In other words, you're telling me to crush it with the back of a knife. I hear you. Azaku Baruch, right? I completely understand. That's a Why is it a shinui? Who cares if I do it in a bowl or in a mortar? Who cares? Does anybody care what the surface is on the table? It's in a bowl, it's in a mortar. That's not the shinui. You hear a problem here, right? Why? That's basically what Maran says. I mean, that's the question is like in the melacha, in the actual physical exertion, or the mechanism of the way I'm crushing this, it's not different. I'm doing it with the back of a sakin, with the back of a knife. the surface upon which it's being crushed or grinded makes zero difference in the mechanism of what I'm doing. It's just the looks of it. Why is that a problem on Shabbat? Why can't I do one? Why does Maran Shulchan Aruch say it has to be in a bowl, not in a mortar, right? So Maran in Bet Yosef asks this question, and he says the Magen Avraham understands that this is because of what we said before, that you need two shinuim, two modifications. So it says Magen Avraham, one modification is the fact that you're doing it with the back of a sakin instead of doing it with a professional grinder. But the other modification is you're doing it not in a mortar, you're doing it in a bowl. So two modifications. It's just to change it as much as possible from the biblical action of grinding something. Biblically speaking, people, you take a grinder or you take a mortar and you crush and you grind and do whatever it is that you're doing, right? To change that, you need two modifications, as we established already before. So it says Magen Avraham, guess what the two are? This is the two. One of them is the fact that you don't have a mortar. But the Taz says no. Taz says only, as you said, it's an issue of how it appears to the onlooker, because it is uvdin dechol, right? It's dumya dechol. It is the way you do it in a mundane way, is to do it with this. We don't do things in a mundane way on Shabbat, even things that are mutar. You remember, recently we spoke about the entire she'ela of brushing tooth and Shabbat and so on, and all the three problems that different poskim bring up, and Chacham Obadia says all of them one by one basically is mikar adin mutar. But he also says, okay, have a Shabbat toothbrush, a separate one, shouldn't be uvdin dechol and so on, right? So we want to do things a little differently on Shabbat. It's a real halachic concept. In parentheses, I think this halachic concept is going to become more and more important in the next decade, because as things become automated and smart systems, we should say, smart homes, smart cars, smart everything, are synchronized together, developing a autonomous lifestyle, basically, that you don't have to be as much involved. Much of things, if it's not because of what Rambam writes, why is it that I can muktzeh, when he explains the halachot of muktzeh, which the core of it is really Drabanan, without getting into too many details, Rambam writes, because imagine a Shabbat that you could do everything. You say, oh, one day off, I'm going to move the furniture, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. The whole Shabbat goes by, and you're just doing things. Whereas the purpose of Shabbat is, Hashem wants you to, Shabbat, stop. Right? Stop, think, spend time with Hashem, spend time with your family, spend time learning Torah. You need that one day of a spirituality if you're just doing everything, So, hence the importance of hashkafically, get out of the halachic boundaries for just a moment, hashkafically to understand that Shabbat is not a weekday. And when Chazal say, oh, it's a weekday thing, and you roll your eyes. No, don't roll your eyes, because that is a very important thing. That we don't want it to look like a weekday. That's the whole purpose of Shabbat. If you create a loophole workaround for everything, Moshe Feinstein, you gotta give it to him. That Chacham Adif Minavi. 50 years ago, when he spoke about timers, he says no one should be relying on timers. He says, unfortunately, already people are using it for lights. He says, okay, because that already has been opened up, we can't really close it easily, but leave it at that. Leave it at that, because if you start using timers, and this is back in the day, in the time, you remember how the timers of 50 years ago was? Right? But Rabbi Moshe Feinstein saw this. He says, soon enough, everything is going to be able to be put on timers. Right? This is before the digital age. Moshe said, it'll come a day that everything could be timered, right? Everything could be autonomous. And then what's going to be for with Shabbat? When you could have your car on timer coming and opening the door for you, you get into the car and you're driven to. Are you going to do that then? What's going to be with Yiddishkeit, right? So this is something to be taken seriously, certainly on a hashkafic level, without getting into too much of the details of the halachic aspects of it. Okay, now, again, the Magen Avraham, the Magen Avraham says that, halachically speaking, one shinui is sufficient, and it's either or of the two things that would be good. Either do it with the back of a knife, or do it with a surface in a bowl, and that would be enough. But again, Maharal Shulchan Aruch doesn't necessarily seem to learn like that. Shulchan Aruch Harav, the first Lubavitch Rebbe, he writes in his Shulchan Aruch that even though that he usually values the opinion of Magen Avraham very heavily, as he should, Magen Avraham is the Gdol HaAchronim, but over here he kind of like puts it aside, says you need you can't have it in a mortar. He paskins like the Taz, and says when possible you should be machmir and not mikil. Okay, Mishnah Berurah over here brings a bunch of achronim that all of them require two shinuyim, not like the Magen Avraham. This is brought in Sif Katan Chafchet in Shar HaTziyun, in the in Shar HaTziyun, the place that he actually names and enumerates the poskim that he brings in the Mishnah Berurah. He says, Olat Shabbat, Katav da'afir b'madoch shel etz yesh li zayer bazeh, and it brings the Taz, Eliyahu Rabbah, Mate Yehuda, Gra, Od Harbe Achronim, many who are Machmir, Delo ke Magen Avraham. Says with all due respect, again, the Mishnah Berurah, for you to know the hierarchy, the Mishnah Berurah has a lot of value for Magen Avraham. The greatest value he has for the Vilna Gaon. Mishnah Berurah is very, very much bound to the psak of the Vilna Gaon. But again, over here, he brings all the Gra included, and he says, with all due respect to Magen Avraham, the halacha would be stringent that you need two shinuyim over here. Fine. So that's as far as Seif Zayin is concerned. Now Seif Chet is very much similar. Seif Chet is talking about salt. Now salt would be very similar, but there's two differences, right? A, salt does not necessarily grow out of the ground, right? Salt has two different ways that we deal with salt. One is the rock formation that you find and you extract, you mine, and then you grind, right? That's one. And then the second one is from the seawater. That means there were particles, small particles. Now you boil the water, you mash them together, and then you have salt, right? Why is this important to know this? Because the ones that come from the sea salt, right? That is much more kula, much more lenient than the rock, which is natural formation of it, and natural state is in a piece of stone, basically, that you grind. Because this was already small particles you mashed together. It's like bread. Can you cut bread to small pieces in Shabbat? Can you? Small. Yes, you can. Why? Because in Tochein achar Tochein, this was already ground. It was flour. Now you piece the particles together with water and whatever you did, right? And now you're just taking it apart again. Mutar. Same would be with the sea salt, if it's actually legit, right? Make sure it's not just to charge you more money. If it's actually sea salt, so then there's no isur of tochen, because en techina achat techina, right? But when you have actual rocks, and you're grinding it, then it's a bigger problem, even though that it's not necessarily simply put, gidule karka. So says Maran of Shulchan Aruch, Ein kotetin melach b'madoch. You cannot crush and grind salt, in its rock state, in a mortar, in a meducha. You can't do it, even in a meducha shel etz. Now, as we mentioned before, the real way of doing it would be stone, right? Etz is a level lower. It's like a home use, for small stuff. You use wooden mortar, right? So he says you can't do it even with the wooden one. Certainly, says the Mishnah Berurah, you cannot do it with the Evan, right? Pashut. Aval meraseku beyad shel sakin ube'etz parur. But you could do it with a wooden spoon with a back handle of a knife. You could do it. Ve'eno hoshesh. And you don't have to be worried. Now, this is where the Mishnah Berurah says, biyad shel sakin, aber lechotcho dak bechurpa da sakina asur, says the Mishnah Berurah in Sif Katan Chav Zayin. Right? So you can't do it with a blade, even though that's knife, even though that's salt here, not pepper. Still says you cannot do it dak with the blade of a sakin. So that again gets into the question we're going to deal with in Sif Yud Bet of Israeli salad and all those things that you want, a sabzi that you want to cut to small pieces. That would be a problem on Shabbat, perhaps, which the definition and the boundaries of it we will discuss in the next shiur Be'ez Hashem. So we're probably one of the most important things to discuss, right? So says the Shulchan Aruch. It is mutar to do it with the back of a knife handle, or in a bowl. That's mutar in case of salt. And as we mentioned before, caked salt, which is like sea salt that has been caked together, that will be mutar. There's no prohibition against that, right? Now the Ramah says over here, v'davka melach hagas. אבל מלח שהיה דק מתחילה ונתבשל ונעשה פתיתין, caked salt, basically, without saying it, mutar. And sometimes it's not just caked salt. Sometimes it's not just sea salt. Sometimes even the salt that was not necessarily good quality, they melt it. They take the purification process is that they cook it, right? They sift through, make sure all the impurities are taken out. Then they kind of like make the salt that we have nowadays. So even if it's not sea salt, you still have to look into how the process is. Maybe somebody could research this briefly and get back to the group whether or not it's done in the commercial process of processing salt. Because again, we don't have rock. Anyone remembers back in East when they had the rocks? Salt. No one has seen them. You've seen them? Only one person. Oh my gosh. No, it's like, oh, I feel very old now, right? What?
Like by the Dead Sea.
No, not that. It's, the ones that they mine. Just big pieces of salt. There's such a thing. There's actually in Teva. In nature, you could find salt. What's that?
Himalayan salt.
Yeah. Again, you could, but in its actual big rock, right? So there, and that is the. But I'm not sure if even if it's not sea salt, right? The salt that is a kitchen salt that they use, even if it's not sea salt, I'm not sure if they're taking a Himalayan piece of thing and putting it there, grinding it without purification and making sure that it's a high quality. I don't know. Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. Something to look into. But if they don't, that means if they melt this or grind it and then purify it, whatever they do, and then they put it back together, and now you're grinding it. Okay, so that's already that's already mutar, because that's a reconstructed salt, right? So that's something to look at. But again, the pepper, especially those the pepper shakers that you have and you grind it as it pours, that's a recipe for a very salty and warm place. Yeah, that's a right. That would be asur pashtut. Okay. Siftet says again the backbone of Siftet is a passage in Trumat Hadeshen, right? One of the late Rishonim. The Trumat Hadeshen writes that everyone agrees that you could cut cooked or roasted meat. Now here is where Maran, this is a very essential Sif Tet, that talks about that the Isur of Tchina, Tochein, is only applicable to Gidule Karka, to things that grow from the ground, right? So I want to grind cheese, I want to grind meat, cut to small pieces. Mutar Asur. So we're going to learn it just right now. So it starts from a Trumat Hadeshen. The Maram brings in Bet Yosef. Trumat says everyone agrees. They could take edible, cooked, or roasted meat and cut it to small pieces, right? Unlike fruits and vegetables or wood, that you can't do that, says the Trumat Hadeshen, you could cut it finely in small pieces for elderly people who can't eat it as big pieces, because, says the Trumat Hadeshen, because most people could eat it in big pieces too. So therefore, once most people could eat it in big pieces too, you could make it small pieces for elderly adults. So obviously, but then he says also you can't take raw pieces of meat and cut them to small pieces for your chickens, to feed them to your pets. You can't do that, right? Because you're making them edible, right? You're enabling them to be eating these pieces, right? Why is that? A, because they can't eat it without cutting them, right? And therefore, cutting meat in that case is called grinding. And B, because you are making food. You're making something that was not edible. Now, so that both of those two things need to be understood, right? Because the obvious question on this Trumat Hadeshen is, like, why don't you make this simple? If you're telling me that meat is not Gidule Karka, right? By the way, according to Rambam, meat is Gidule Karka, right? What? Right? Because again, that's the whole Gemara. Gidule Mina Karka, Gidule Karka, going Brachot already alludes to this, but Rambam holds meat is considered Gidule Karka. It comes as a surprise to people. But if you tell me that this is not Gidule Karka, mutar should be mutar. Why is this? Why is the reason that's mutar to cut the pieces, the meat to small pieces for the elderly? Because majority of people could eat it as is. Why do you need that? Let's imagine majority of people can't eat it as is. Well, can't cut it? Still not Gidule Karka. So there's certainly more than meets the eye in Trumat Hadeshen needs to be discussed. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So, Shulchan Aruch writes, and I read, it's a small sif. Mutar lachatoch basar mebushal or sali dak. Cooked or roasted meat. You could cut it small pieces, right? Besakin, with a knife. That's Maran Shulchan Aruch. That's it. Right? No ifs and buts. The Ramah comes in. Aval asur lachtoch tak basar chai. Raw meat that you want to cut for your cat, for your dog, for your chickens, asur. You can't do it. Why? Because they can't eat it in chunks, in big pieces, without you cutting it. Pay attention to the. You are making this food right now. It's not food because you can't eat it like this in chunks. So you are creating ochel here, and that's a problem. Now, there's a lot to talk about this, right? There's a lot to talk about this, and we're just going to go try to cover things quickly, because this Rema seems to be standing in direct contradiction with Maran Shulchan Aruch later on in Siman Shin Chav Dalet, right? And that's, of course, going to be a massive problem, right? It's going to be a massive problem. If I have it here, find this quickly. Maran writes, מחתכין דלויים לפני בהמה והוא שנתלשו מאתמול, right? מחתכין נבלה לפני, סעיף ו' סעיף ז', נבלה לפני כלבים, אפילו נתנבלה היום בין שהייתה מחוץ. It doesn't make it, you could do it. You could create food for your pets on Shabbat. Like blatant stira, right? And as you'll see, all of the Achronim are going to be like bothered by this. See, what in the actual Shulchan Aruch is the Rama talking about? Where is this coming from? We don't paskin like this Trumat edition. It's a Beferish Shulchan Aruch later on. Like Maran does not paskin like this Trumat edition in this element of the halacha, right? Most blatantly brought out by the Vilna Gaon, as we'll discuss. But for our purposes, let's go step by step, just to understand this well. So it says, the Tas and the Magen Avraham and the Vilna Gaon, all three of them, they write that grinding the Isur of Tochein only applies to Gidulei Karka, to things that grow out of the ground, right? The Chazon Ish has a Chumrah in Siman Nun Zayin that, it does apply, at least in a Drabanan level, even to dried mud by itself. Anything that has been nitgabel, has been put together. So imagine you have a little glob of dried mud on your thing and you want to kind of get rid of it, right? The fact that you're going to now be mefarer, you're going to grind it up, says the Chazon Ish, that would be considered asur as well. Okay, now this is just opening a can of worms of what else is included in this, which we're not going to get into too much of that right now, but again, just to keep in mind. Now, the question that we asked, the $1 million question, if Trumat Hadeshen acknowledges the meat is not Gidulei Karka, and again, in parentheses, we know about the Rambam Shita, fine? But if he acknowledges that this is not Gidulei Karka, why do you need this whole business of the majority of people could eat it big, therefore you could make it small? Why you need that, right? So different Achronim have different opinions about this. For instance, there's a Tosafot in Masechet Shabbat of Ayin Dalit that says the Isra of Tochein only applies to beets, right? It's a problem with not all food, but beets, but not other foods. But only when the food is edible, without the grinding, without the cutting. If you are making it edible with cutting, says the Machzit Sheker, based on that Tosafot, that's where the problem starts. So therefore, even though that meat is not quote-unquote Gidulei Karka, you could only cut it to small pieces if it's edible, because there is another level of the Isur of grinding applicable to all the things that are even not Gidulei Karka, that are not in part and parcel of the classic Tochein Sugya, provided that they were not edible and now you're making them edible. So it says the Machzit Sheker, you know where this concept comes from that Tosafot, right? From that sugya, that's where you see it, right? The Magen Avraham says that it brings a Shitei Giborim that we are still mahmir, even though that we recognize that meat is not gidule karka, but because of the shita of the Rambam and others that may consider it gidule karka, we still are mindful of it, and that's how he kind of like explains this, right? Again, over here, this Magen Avraham is a massive chumrah, because he says you have to reckon with the Rambam's shita. Everyone disagrees with it. The Mishnah Berurah disagrees with it. The Shulchan Aruch Harav, even though it usually idolizes, it very much gives credence to Magen Avraham. Over here, it says we don't pass like it, and the halakha is we don't necessarily concern ourselves with this Magen Avraham of considering meat gidule karka. But nevertheless, using an actual machine, actual kli, would be within the chol in any case. Now, this Ramah now, the last thing we're going to deal with today. This Ramah that stands in direct, sharp contrast with the Shulchan Aruch that we just read in Siman Shin Chaf Dalit. Where does this come from? There's a Gemara in Masechet Shabbat Daf Kuf Nun Hey. There it's Machloket Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda. What exactly is Asur on Shabbat? And they are diametrically opposing shitas. Whether something that you have to be matriach, you have to really work hard and exert yourself, will be asur, right? We call this lemitrach be'ochla tarchinan. Rav Huna holds that we do work hard, it's fine, that's mutar. But l'shavuye ochla lo meshavinan. But you can't create something that was not food and now you're making it food. You cannot do that. Right? Tircha is mutar. But making something that was not edible is asur. That's Rav Huna. Rav Yehuda paskins exactly the opposite. Right? He says tircha you cannot do, but you could make food. Right? Which one of these two we paskin like? So I just read to you Seif Zayin of Shulchan Aruch in Shin Chaf Dalit. We paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. Right? You could create food as long as it's not too hard. You just cut it up, chop it up, you put it in front of your dogs. Chazak Baruch. Mutar. The chickens, mutar. They couldn't eat it before. We don't care. We paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Huna is not a thing in Shulchan Aruch. Right? Whereas Ramah over here seems to paskin like who? Rav Huna. Where's that come from? Right? So the Taz is very upset with the Ramah, both here and in Siman Shin Chaf Dalit. This is what you missed the Shulchan Aruch. How does that work exactly? Right? The Magen Avraham, he tries to explain it, but the Maaseh, he also has the problem. The Vilna Gaon is probably the best. In Sif Katan Yud Bet, he says, I don't understand, I don't get it. I don't understand the Ramah. Because the Trumat HaDeshin writes this reason because he paskins like Rav Huna certainly, right? And the issue of making food. Shulchan Aruch doesn't paskin like Rav Huna. Paskins like Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore I don't get it, basically. Now, the Mishnah Berurah, of course, reckons with this, but halachically speaking, we're out of time now. Halachically speaking, Maran Shulchan Aruch seems to clearly hold like Rabbi Yehuda, and we're passing like that as well. So therefore, meat which is not gidule karka, if you need to make it small pieces for elderly adults and young children and so on, you could do that on Shabbat, and there's no problem. Now, this opens, of course, now that we have the basics of the sugya, opens the door to discussion of how small can you do things that are gidule